Edgar Cayce, known as the sleeping prophet, claimed that the future of humanity would not be defined only by wars or catastrophes, but by something much deeper, the awakening of the soul of the earth. According to him, the world would go through a period in which the planet itself would react to humanity's spiritual forgetfulness. And this reaction would not manifest only in the form of earthquakes, eruptions, or storms, but also as a reflection within the human heart. Among his thousands of readings, there is a sequence of visions that today seem to take on a new meaning. Cayce spoke of a time when Europe, and France in particular, would become the stage of a decisive transformation. He said that the earth would begin to speak and that few people would listen to it. The sea would become restless, the weather unpredictable, and silence would take over human consciousness. And all of this would be the prelude to a new era, an era of trial and revelation.
At first, people would doubt.
They would call it coincidence, natural cycles, irrational fear. But Cayce warned, the earth does not rebel to take revenge but to heal. To him, the planet would be like a wounded body, reacting to the pain caused by greed, indifference, and the loss of faith. And France, he said, would be one of the turning points in this process, a nation marked by light and shadow that would need to remind the world of what is sacred. Today, as we observe the signs, weather anomalies, the imbalance of the seasons, and the silent fear growing among people, these words seem more alive than ever. Perhaps the time he described is approaching like a shadow that is still distant. The moment when the invisible would begin to speak. If you believe that nothing happens by chance and that the spiritual world sends signs to those who know how to observe, then leave your like on this video because you are in the right place. Subscribe to the channel because here we uncover forgotten messages, and what Cayce saw may change the way you see the future. Edgar Cayce believed that the planet was not merely a mass of rocks and seas, but a living organism endowed with consciousness and capable of reacting to human imbalances. He claimed that the earth and humanity were spiritually connected and that every act of destruction, pride, or indifference was reflected somewhere in nature. This connection, which many describe as symbolic, seems today to be taking on more tangible dimensions. The climate has become unstable, the seasons have blurred, and the feeling that something is wrong is spreading silently. Cayce spoke of subtle signs that would initially go unnoticed. He described subtle changes in ocean temperatures, the movement of underground plates, and the behavior of the winds. But he claimed that the true warning would not come from catastrophes, but from human behavior. The heart of man and the heart of the earth beat together, he declared during one of his readings. When one slows down, the other suffers. When man loses faith, the earth loses its balance. In recent years, phenomena once considered improbable have multiplied throughout Europe. Regions historically considered stable have begun recording slight tremors. Tropical winds sweep across the Mediterranean, and heat settles in places where cold once prevailed. For many, this is simply climate change. For others, it is the language of the earth described by Cayce, a warning in the form of imbalance. But there is something even more mysterious. In several places across the continent, the ground seems to breathe. Regions that were once dry are beginning to sink. Groundwater levels are rising inexplicably, and ancient geological formations are beginning to move again. Geologists are trying to understand it, but nothing seems to fit completely. In one of these visions, Cayce spoke of a time when the planet would release forces sleeping beneath the seas and mountains. He claimed that these forces would not immediately destroy, but would silently transform the face of the earth until humanity understood that the danger came from within. France, he said, would be one of the places where nature would speak first, not through fire or destruction, but through unusual phenomena, fog, sudden changes in temperature, rivers changing their course, and skies changing color. These descriptions, which seemed poetic a century ago, today coincide with reports of the aurora borealis visible in northern France and atmospheric variations recorded by satellites. Cayce saw this as a double sign, both physical and spiritual. He said that the sky would change not only in color but also in meaning. It would become a mirror of what humanity carried within itself. As humanity moved away from love and compassion, the sky itself would become unstable. Blue would give way to gray, and the light would grow colder. He did not see this as punishment, but as a divine warning, a call to remember that all life is connected. But there was something even more troubling. He spoke of an invisible pulsation that would cross the planet, a kind of vibration that would affect not only the earth but also the human mind. He called it the resonance of the spirit. According to Cayce, during periods of purification, the collective unconscious would become more sensitive, absorbing fears, anxieties, and premonitions. This would explain why, during periods of great instability, so many people report prophetic dreams, feelings of urgency, or unexplained discomfort. In many of his readings, Cayce claimed that Europe would be the mirror of the world. What had begun there would spread not through military force, but through spiritual vibration. That is why he said France would play a crucial role. He called it the land of the heart, convinced that the spiritual rebirth of the world would emerge from the very place where faith and culture had once flourished. However, he warned that before the light would come forgetfulness, a period of spiritual indifference and emptiness in which many would lose hope and believe that everything was lost. This would be the first sign of a real danger. Not fire or water, but apathy. For Cayce, humanity would fall not because of external catastrophes, but because of internal ones. When man stops seeking the divine, the earth stops breathing with him, he said. And it was precisely this spiritual silence that he called the beginning of the night of the soul. Today, looking around us, it is difficult not to imagine that this night may be approaching. While many struggled to understand what was happening in the physical world, Edgar Cayce claimed that the true change would arise not in matter, but in vibrations. He spoke of an inaudible sound, an echo from the future capable of crossing time and touching the collective unconscious. To him, the universe was not silent. It was we who had forgotten how to listen. In several of his readings, Cayce mentioned that humanity would be warned 3 times. The first time through nature, the second time through the body itself, and the third time through the spirit. When humanity ignored the external signs, the warning would come from within. And when it ignored its feelings, the warning would become visible, reflected in the world. He described this sequence as the Earth's call to return. Recently, this idea seems to be gaining ground. Thousands of people report strange symptoms, unreasonable anxiety, intense dreams, sensations of heaviness, as though something invisible were hanging over everyone. Researchers explain it scientifically: stress, tension, collective fear. But Cayce called it the beginning of a vibrational shock. He explained that the planet and its inhabitants vibrated in resonance and that when this harmony was broken, both would suffer. The human body, he believed, is the mirror of the earth. During one of his trances, Cayce described a curious vision. He saw the sky changing hue, as if the light had lost its joy. He claimed that this transformation would mark the beginning of a spiritual imbalance. When the sun no longer warms the hearts of men, he said, the earth will seek warmth within itself. These words, spoken in 1932, sound today like an omen. They evoke a coldness that is not physical but moral, the growing distance between human beings, the widening gap between faith and reason, between what we feel and what we believe. He also warned against excessive noise. The world, Cayce said, would be flooded with sound and distraction, preventing people from hearing what silence was trying to say. And indeed, we have never been so connected and yet so far removed from what is essential. He saw this excess as part of a cycle. The more noise human beings make, the deeper the silence that follows becomes. The silence of the soul, the silence of the earth. In Europe, curious signs seem to correspond with these words. The seasons become confused. Rare celestial phenomena appear in unlikely regions, and the landscape itself seems charged with a melancholy that few can explain. It is not fear. It is a kind of collective apprehension, something stirring beneath the surface, invisible yet palpable. Cayce claimed that this sensation would precede a change in consciousness. Those who feel before they see will be the guardians of the new era, he wrote. He believed that when the world was about to pass through a crisis, the human spirit would awaken in some people before others. They would be the ones who kept the light burning when the rest of the world descended into turmoil. He also warned that fear would be the first enemy. When man fears the unknown, he closes his eyes and surrenders to denial. That is why Cayce insisted, do not fear the trembling of the earth, fear instead the hardening of the heart. The danger for him did not lie in tectonic plates, but in the soul that refuses to change. Today, when we observe human behavior, the rush, spiritual fatigue, emptiness disguised as progress, it is impossible not to feel that the warning is already resonating. The earth speaks, but in a language we have forgotten how to understand. It is not the language of catastrophe, but the language of warning. Something is calling us back to lost harmony. Cayce believed that those who silently perceived these signs would be the new messengers. Not prophets in the ancient sense of the word, but attentive observers capable of hearing the breathing of the planet. He called them observers of the threshold. Perhaps at this very moment each of us is being invited to become one of them, to hear what the world is trying to say before the noise completely obscures the truth. Cayce declared that only the vigilant would know how to recognize the signs. If you feel this call, say, "I watch in silence." Sometimes, simply remaining awake is the most powerful way to manifest your faith. For much of the 20th century, Edgar Cayce's visions were regarded as spiritual curiosities, fascinating stories that were rarely taken seriously. Doctors, geologists, and astronomers of the time interpreted them as the ramblings of a man in a trance. Yet nearly a century later, many of the phenomena he described are being observed by satellites, sensors, and scientific cameras. What was once mysticism is beginning to take on the contours of reality. In one of his most discussed readings, Cayce mentioned that the depths of the earth would stir like a restless heart. He spoke of an internal pulse, a rhythm that would change before great transformations. This claim was ignored for a long time until recent studies revealed a surprise. Scientists discovered that the planet's core, previously considered stable, changes its rotational speed. Some researchers say that the heart of the Earth literally pulses, sometimes accelerating, sometimes slowing, affecting the magnetic field and consequently the global climate. Cayce never studied geophysics, yet his words seem to describe precisely this phenomenon. He said that when the interior of the Earth loses its compass, the surface reacts like a shattered mirror. Today, we see this phenomenon reflected in our minds. Earthquakes in unlikely places, dormant volcanoes awakening, intense storms emerging at increasingly short intervals. And what is interesting is that many of these manifestations are concentrated in regions he mentioned in his readings: the North Atlantic, the Mediterranean, and the lands of southern Europe. In France, weather records from recent decades show an unprecedented acceleration of extreme phenomena. Record heat waves, sudden droughts, and torrential rains. Scientists see them as a natural consequence of global warming. For those familiar with Cayce, they echo his warnings. He claimed that fire and water would exchange places. Heat would emerge where there had been cold, and water would invade lands once considered safe. But Cayce was not speaking only about geology or meteorology. In several of his readings, he mentioned the invisible magnetic forces surrounding the planet and influencing the mental and emotional balance of humanity. Today, these forces have names: solar storms, fluctuations in the magnetic field, cosmic interference. Recent research suggests that solar activity can affect aspects of human physiology and behavior. What once seemed like pure spiritual allegory is beginning to enter the language of science. However, Cayce saw something beyond the physical explanation. He claimed that these disturbances were not punishments, but invitations to reflection. The Creator speaks through nature, he said. When man turns away from his voice, the physical world becomes his interpreter. In other words, every natural event would also be a spiritual symbol, a coded message. An earthquake would represent not only the movement of plates, but also the instability of souls. Storms would mirror human conflicts: extreme heat, consuming pride; sudden cold, the absence of compassion. In recent years, even scholars who do not believe in prophecies have begun to acknowledge one common point. Never before has the earth reacted so rapidly to human actions. Nature's response time seems to be shortening, and consequences appear almost instantly. Cayce once said that the spiritual harvest would come at the speed of thought. What man sows with his heart, the planet manifests in form. There is something profoundly symbolic in this convergence between science and spirituality. For centuries, the two traveled separately, one searching for proof, the other for meaning. Today, they seem to be facing the same mystery. The Earth is changing, and no one knows exactly why. Perhaps what we see today, climate change, the imbalance of the seas, human unrest, are not merely isolated symptoms but elements of the same movement. A realignment between the visible and the invisible, between humanity and the cosmos. And while scientists attempt to measure the trembling of the Earth, perhaps what is truly moving is something much greater, the soul of the world finally awakening from its sleep. For years, people believed that everything Edgar Cayce had said had been properly published, catalogued, and sealed within volumes accessible to anyone curious enough to read them. The figure was repeated, more than 14,000 readings, as though that number could put a final period on the subject. But when European researchers began cross-referencing old letters, secretaries' journals, and family notes, another story emerged. There were unpublished pages, crossed-out passages, incomplete dates, marginal symbols, and references to sessions that were supposed to remain silent for a time. These texts were not hidden out of vanity, but out of caution. Some claimed that certain passages could cause panic. Others feared crude interpretations of what, for Cayce, were spiritual images requiring discernment. The fact is that between 1933 and 1944, there appears a series of less discussed documents preserved in safes and private archives, coming to light at the very moment when the world is beginning to ask different questions. In these pages, Cayce's voice seems slower, more detached from everyday life, as though he were speaking from a place where time does not flow forward but around itself. There is no detailed map, no precise chronology. There are, however, phrases that seem essential. When the world loses the language of the soul, the planet will translate the pain into movement. Written down after a report about a conflict in Europe, this phrase was accompanied by images: seas rising as though they were breathing, lands opening with the sound of a sigh, cities wrapped in a golden mist that does not blind but awakens memories.
At the time, many called it allegory.
Today, as unusual phenomena repeat without obeying old calendars, the metaphor no longer seems so distant from reality. Another series of passages speaks of dormant lines, deep currents that would cross the continents and that, if inadvertently disturbed by modern humanity, would alter the Earth's magnetic balance. Cayce uses no technical jargon. He describes them as he sees them: invisible pathways, the nerves of the planet, cables beneath the seas. Decades later, as science begins to map natural currents, ocean conductivity, and large-scale human interference, these simple images take on the color of reality. Yet Cayce's tone remains the same. There is no accusation or condemnation. Only the idea that everything alive reacts to what is done to it: the human body, the social body, the body of the Earth. In marginal notes scribbled by different secretaries, an enigmatic temporal signature appears several times: the third decade of the century to come. It is not an explicit date.
It is a glimpse, a frame.
For some, it is nothing more than poetic license. For others, it is recognition that certain changes mature beneath the surface before emerging. And among these layers, France emerges with a consistency that is difficult to ignore. In 1939, it is written, "The spiritual flame of the West will ignite when the waters rise, not through power, but through remembrance." The manuscript does not explain what rise means, nor does it define spiritual flame. The strength of the text lies not in its cartography, but in its call: remember what sustains us when the ground loses its name. There are also passages about an axis of transition. Cayce insists that the inclination begins in the invisible, in what human beings call consciousness, which from above appears as a shimmering field. When the collective heart becomes disoriented, the physical world seeks another center. A hurried reader will see superstition, another exaggeration. But those who read slowly understand that Cayce is speaking about a mirror. The inside becoming the outside reflecting the inside. It is not a punishment falling upon us, but an equilibrium seeking rest. That is why he avoids the word destruction and prefers purification, realignment, return. When the earth moves, do not fear, one can read from his words. Fear remaining still when everything demands change. Perhaps this is the most disturbing aspect of the forgotten documents. It removes us from the position of spectators. These are not prophecies to applaud from afar, but invitations to examine the rigidity with which we defend what no longer stands. The temptation is great to demand dates, maps, guarantees. Cayce, however, speaks of actions, relearning how to listen, reorganizing priorities, restoring breath to faith rather than to our slogans. That is why, even when he speaks of seas and lands, he quickly returns to familiar words: compassion, service, truth. Because if the planet is alive, it responds better to hands that heal than to eyes that merely watch, anticipating the worst. The documents remain partly under lock and key. Perhaps they will never all be published. Perhaps it will not even be necessary. There is in these archives a humility reminiscent of Cayce himself. It is not about shining in the darkness, but about lighting a match strong enough to take the next step. What seems important is not possessing the complete text, but recognizing what he repeatedly insisted on saying in every possible way: the outer world will be the mirror of the inner world. When one loses its way, the other begins to correct the course. If it is true that certain pages were reserved for a more mature age, perhaps maturity does not depend on years, but on the kind of question we dare to ask. Instead of asking, "When will this happen?" ask yourself, "How will I respond?" Instead of asking, "What will come from outside?" ask, "What do I need to realign within myself?" It is in this exchange of questions that the rumbling of lost vaults loses its fascination and the table of our home is transformed into an altar. Because the secret we seek does not lie in sudden leaps, but in the way we open our hands. If you feel that it is time to protect what is essential, write in the comments, "I keep the flame." When you write it, remember, it is not merely a phrase. It is a silent commitment to what is still pure. A decision to keep burning the light that the world tries to extinguish. Recent decades seem gradually to confirm the idea that the planet is not merely changing, but reacting. Natural cycles are accelerating, sea levels are rising, and the boundaries between the predictable and the unprecedented are fading. What once took centuries now seems to happen within years, as though time itself had lost its ancient rhythm. Edgar Cayce called this the haste of the earth. He claimed that if humanity denied its own inner rhythms, rest, prayer, contemplation, nature would evolve at a speed equal to human impatience. Today, the rhythm of cities seems to dictate the rhythm of the winds. Europe in particular shows signs of saturation. Every summer, heat waves sweep across regions that for centuries were synonymous with climatic balance. Lakes disappear. Forests that once remained green until the end of autumn burn beneath a sun that no longer respects the calendar. Science describes the causes and effects precisely, but the feeling remains: there is something deeper than simple atmospheric disorder. It is as though the planet were trying to teach us an ancient language made of pauses and silent warnings. Cayce said that the earth speaks first to those who still know how to feel, and perhaps that is why unease is growing even among those who do not believe in prophecies. But what distinguishes this period from all others is not only the intensity of the changes, but also their impact on the human soul. Never before has such spiritual fatigue seemed so widespread. People are exhausted without knowing why, unable to find meaning in their lives even when they lack nothing. Emptiness has become collective, and Cayce had already spoken of it. Weariness of the soul will be the first symptom of purification. He believed that the planet and its inhabitants would undergo the same process of purification, exhaustion followed by renewal. Before healing would come the fever. Before light, dizziness. Some modern scholars describe this state as a fatigue of global consciousness. We live in an age of technological abundance but emotional poverty. Humanity observes the universe but forgets what sustains it inwardly. It is the same pattern Cayce described in his metaphor of spiritual breathing. When man breathes only his own ego and gives no thanks, the air of the world becomes heavy. Many interpreted this as poetry. Few considered the warning literally. The atmosphere that breathes with us is beginning to become poisoned. Temperatures rise, winds rage, and every external imbalance reflects the internal disorder of a species that has lost its sense of the sacred. What is striking is that despite so much evidence, humanity continues trying to correct only the symptoms. People speak of saving the planet, but rarely of healing the human heart. Cayce said this was inevitable. Humanity would try to repair the sky with technology without understanding that the true whole lies within its own soul. For him, the restoration of the earth would begin with repentance, not calculation. What was needed was a reconnection with mystery, a humility that would restore to nature its right to be a teacher. In his readings, he used a curious expression, the pedagogical night, a period of shadow and uncertainty that would teach what light alone could not.
It would not be an end, but a process.
The planet would purify itself alongside humanity. He described this period as a journey in 3 stages. First discomfort, then confusion, and finally revelation. We seem to be caught between the first 2. Discomfort spreads, confusion grows, and what comes next remains unknown. The signs announcing the approach of something greater are subtle but constant. Glaciers melt, oceans expand, and at the same time spiritual coincidences, lucid dreams, and inexplicable perceptions are reported. It is as though the invisible were trying to make its way through. Cayce had predicted it. Before the eye sees, the spirit hears. Perhaps we are standing at this threshold between the invisible announcing itself and the visible still hesitating to accept it. There is also what he called the turning point. A moment when everything seems to stop, suspended between what was and what will be. It is not destruction, but a pause. Nature catches its breath. Humanity falls silent, and the universe, for a second, seems to wait for a choice. For Cayce, that choice would define the centuries to come, continue the noise or rediscover silence. The future of the world, he wrote, does not depend on what it builds, but on what it remembers. Perhaps this is what he meant when he claimed that the spiritual night would not come as punishment, but as medicine. Darkness would be the interval necessary for humanity to perceive its own light. And if it is true that the planet is alive, perhaps it is simply trying to wake us with as little pain as possible. A touch, a tremor, a whisper, the gestures of a teacher warning us. And we, deafened by so much noise, mistake the warning for a threat. What Cayce called the time of transition may already have begun, but it is still only at dawn, not yet the storm. A prelude, not a climax, a call lingering in the air, waiting for someone amid the noise to finally hear it. Throughout his life, Edgar Cayce insisted that the destiny of humanity was not carved in stone. The future, he said, was malleable like clay, shaped by collective choices and the spiritual state of individuals. This vision distinguished him from many other prophets. To him, the visions he received were not certainties, but warnings. He believed that every generation had the power to change the course of predictions, provided it chose the voice of conscience. No prophecy is a sentence, he once declared. It is only a reflection of what will happen if nothing is done. And what he saw when looking toward the century to come was not only destruction, but an opportunity for rebirth born from pain. The readings he gave during the final years of his life became some of the most mysterious and, at the same time, the most spiritual. Cayce spoke of a time when humanity would bear the weight of its own forgetfulness. This enigmatic phrase seems more relevant than ever. Forget what? For him, forgetting where we come from and why we are here was the first step toward moral and physical collapse. He claimed that modern civilization would be tempted to replace faith with efficiency, wisdom with information, and love with control. This inversion, he said, would lead to the gradual emptying of the collective soul. Humanity would continue to produce and innovate, but without knowing for whom or why. And it was in this moment of confusion that the planet would begin to act as both a mirror and a warning. Cayce described this period as humanity's crossing of the gulf between spirit and soul. This gulf would not be literal but symbolic, the distance between what we know and what we feel, between external progress and internal emptiness. During this crossing, he said, each person would be tested differently. Some through faith, others through loss, and still others through silence. He saw this as a kind of inner judgment in which the true judgment would come not from outside, but from within. Man will not be punished by God, he declared in one of his visions. He will judge himself by the measure of his own works. The most troubling passage in these readings speaks of a time of withdrawal, a period in which the forces of the earth and the human spirit would synchronize. He said that the planet would seem to hold its breath, as if waiting for something. During this interval, systems founded on fear and falsehood would begin to collapse, and truth, even painful truth, would emerge as a purifying force. Everything that is false will become unsustainable, he wrote. And everything that is true, however small, will remain. Many of his followers interpret this passage as a reference to a global crisis that would be not only political or environmental, but also spiritual. The collapse would not come to destroy, but would open the way for a new awakening. Interestingly, he did not see this as a tragedy, but as a necessity. He spoke of pain as the final divine resource. When man does not listen to the voice of his conscience, the universe speaks louder. For Cayce, this was the role of signs: earthquakes, storms, epidemics, revolts. They were not punishments but cosmic messengers attempting to return humanity to truth. He believed that suffering became evil only when it was wasted, when human beings transformed it into resentment instead of repentance. In these final trances, Cayce also spoke of a spiritual night that would precede the dawn of a new era. He described this period as a symbolic darkness in which human values would seem to disappear. Compassion would be mistaken for weakness and truth for madness. At that moment, he said, many would lose hope and believe that everything was over. But it would be precisely then, in the deepest darkness, that light would begin to appear. A time will come when the world will seem directionless, he predicted. But it is then that the heart of man will be weighed, and that weight, if it is the weight of love, will save him. Some interpret these words as the announcement of a final crisis, a breaking point. Others see them as a description of a process already underway, a painful but necessary awakening. Whatever the case, what emerges from these readings is the certainty that the future is not lost. Cayce saw pain as having a teaching purpose. He believed that the earth would not destroy us, but would simply remind us of what we have forgotten. That every act of indifference resonates through stones, bones, and air. That every act of love possesses a healing power that transcends borders and centuries. That is why he spoke so often about collective consciousness. Salvation, he said, would not be individual. One awakened heart matters, but 1,000 awakened hearts transform the planet. When love becomes a real force, not merely a feeling but an action, the earth will respond in harmony. This would be the true turning of the axis, not physical but moral. The axis of the world would stop revolving around fear and begin revolving around faith. Today, these words resonate like a living prophecy waiting to be understood. Perhaps we are passing through that silent night of which he spoke, and perhaps beneath the weight of confusion, the human soul is about to rediscover the center it has lost. Cayce said that after pain comes remembrance. And when that remembrance arrives, not in the form of nostalgia but recognition, it will be the sign that dawn is near. In the last readings recorded before his death, Edgar Cayce seemed more serene than ever. He spoke of a difficult future, but not a hopeless one. He described a cycle that would reach the limits of pain in order to rediscover the meaning of the sacred. He called it the harvest of light. He said that suffering would be the soil in which true compassion would germinate, and that after the time of trials would come the time of reconstruction. Humanity, he said, would learn to value the invisible again, that which can neither be bought nor measured. When man has lost everything external, he wrote, he will discover that what was inside remained intact. In these final words, Cayce did not sound like someone giving a warning, but rather someone offering comfort. He spoke of a new wisdom born of humility, of small communities guided by spiritual principles rather than power. He believed that after the night, the earth would become calmer again, the sky clearer, and hearts slower. Not because of fear, but because of reverence. It was as though he could see the planet breathing peacefully again. He described this moment as the return of the divine pulse, when the world and humanity would once again vibrate at the same frequency. Scholars who have examined these notes noticed one constant. Cayce never ended a reading with destruction. He always concluded with a gesture of hope, even in the darkest visions. He claimed that changes would come to restore, not to punish. That fire would not come out of hunger, but for purification, that water would not come to drown, but to wash, and that silence, however frightening, is only the space where the voice of God can once again be heard. After the noise of fear, he wrote, there will be a moment of peace so deep that the world will weep, not from sorrow, but from remembrance. That remembrance, according to him, would be the true miracle. It would not be about seeing angels or lights in the sky, but recognizing the divine in simplicity, in an anonymous gesture, in a kind word, in forgiveness granted without merit. He said that the next spiritual awakening would not come from organized religions, but from silent souls. Those who kneel alone in the darkness, he said, are the ones who will keep the flame alive until dawn. These people, anonymous and scattered throughout the world, would be the invisible guardians of the new era. They would not preach, but they would live their faith. They would not lecture, but they would heal. Cayce saw a particular role for France. He called it the land of the wounded heart. He believed that after centuries of conflict and unbelief, it would have the mission of witnessing the spiritual rebirth of the West, not as a power, but as a testimony of compassion. He said that from lands where blood had flowed, a new seed of fraternity would germinate. The flower will be born from the ruins, he wrote, and its fragrance will remind men that love is older than fear. Many considered these phrases mere poetry. Others saw in them the perfect metaphor for a continent that, weary from pain, could teach the value of peace. Cayce concluded his readings with an almost childlike simplicity. He urged people to pray, not to change their destiny, but to change themselves, to keep their hearts vigilant and their gaze gentle, because evil triumphs only where goodness remains silent. He saw prayer as the connection between the human and the eternal, the thread that keeps the world from falling apart. He believed that every loving thought was like a luminous seed planted in the invisible soil of the Spirit, and that together these seeds could change the course of history. Today, facing a world divided between fear and hope, it is difficult not to think of these words. Perhaps what Cayce sensed was not an event, but a process, not a punishment, but a call. The awakening he announced may already be underway, not as a spectacle, but as a silent transformation. Because true miracles never come from outside. They blossom the moment humanity decides to become light, even when surrounded by shadow. Perhaps, in the end, this is what Cayce meant from the beginning. The future is only a reflection of what the human heart becomes. When it closes, the world grows dark. When it opens, the world renews itself. And in this opening and closing of consciousness, all of history is written and rewritten. If you believe that even in darkness light can be reborn, write in the comments, "The flower will be born from the ruins." Your comment could touch another soul. Your like can spread this message to those who need it most. And if you wish to continue this spiritual journey with us, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell, because the invisible has already begun to become visible.